There's a story that's breaking that seems to be almost entirely on Twitter. There are a few just Medium articles, but to the degree that they're talking about, they're citing the Twitter stuff. So we're gonna go to Twitter here. Basically, 60 Minutes, we are told, the long-running CBS, I think, NewsHour show, has been planning a segment on detransitioners. That is, people who have transitioned to the other sex or gender, depending on who you're talking to, and who have decided after some time that it was a mistake and that they're going to detransition back into their natal sex, the sex that they were born as. And as a result of a lot of activist hubbub about this, it seems that CBS may be actually rethinking whether or not to do this. And that I find yet another piece of dangerous evidence that our journalism is being run by narrative and by politics rather than by actually trying to discover what's true. So let's just show a couple of the tweets in question before talking about this. We have Jennifer. I will show this in just a second, Zach. Jennifer Finney Boylan, who's a trans woman and also a Barnard professor and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, who had 28 pieces in the New York Times in 2020 alone. So this is not an infrequent contributor. First introduced this to the world here. Okay, Zachary. Tweet from March 20th. There's going to be a 60 Minutes on detransitioners, she writes. They asked me to be a talking head, and I said I prefer not to be part of this story. They said, please? I said, you ought to talk to Tori Peters, or at least someone AFAB, since that's the focus. They said, we'd really like you, Jennifer Finney Boylan. I said, I'm honored, but I think this is a terrible idea for a story. Why focus on this small group of outliers when you could focus on the struggles and triumphs of so many other trans folks? So just stepping out of this for a moment, trans is itself an outlier group, and trans has gotten a ton of press in the last 5 or 10 years, like really more than any group of that size warrants by the numbers. And so for people in a tiny group of outliers who have been getting much more press than their numbers represent to be complaining about people within their group who frankly may or may not be outliers getting any press at all seems like the best spin I can put on it is it's the height of irony.
It's the height of irony, and it's also obviously duplicitous.
Yes, so that would be a slightly less generous interpretation.
It's yes, slightly less generous, but the simple fact is the reason that detransitioners are forbidden and that there would be pressure put on 60 Minutes is that the strongest argument for a go slow approach, let us leave children to develop as they will and not leap to conclusions, is that not only does dysphoria so regularly clear up on its own, but that many people who do transition decide later it didn't solve the issue that they were hoping it would solve and decide to transition back, at which point you can't fully transition back, right? There are downstream consequences of this. And so, obscuring the awkward fact of many people who have thought that they wanted to transition and discover later that they got bad advice or had misunderstood things is really, it's going to put people in harm's way. This story needs to be covered because everybody who's thinking of transitioning needs to consider the possibility that it isn't the solution for them.
Yes, exactly as, for instance, Abigail Schreier's excellent book needs to be out there and available to people and not be, taken off of the virtual shelves at Amazon. Just two more sort of blue check marks on Twitter who are tweeting about this and who have cultural sway. We have Chase Strangio at the, famous, at least in some circles, trans lawyer at ACLU, who quote tweets the Boylan tweet thread that I just read the beginning of, saying this story is deliberately airing at a time of dangerous assaults on trans healthcare and trans lives, while we, as trans people, are harassed and gaslit when we try to advocate for our ability to just live.
To just live.
I feel like I know who's being gaslit, and it's not Chase Strangio.
Right. Well, that's the core of gaslighting now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So, at a time of dangerous assaults on trans healthcare and trans lives, That will always be the claim. That will always be the claim. And any group, no matter how you define that group, will always be experiencing something that they should not be experiencing, because that is the nature of existence. So there is nothing in here that is falsifiable. And yet the entire thing is of a tone that seems exactly wrong and actually quite deceitful. So just one more of these. Here we have someone, actually, sorry, Zach, give me my screen back just for a minute so I can see. This is someone who is the former editor-in-chief of Out magazine and the former chief commercial officer of Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue, which seems to be one of the sort of spear points of a lot of this madness. The Twitter account is PF Picardi. Again, quote tweets the original Boylan tweet thread saying, "The media illiteracy around trans folks is nothing short of dangerous. I hope the folks at 60 Minutes know there's a human toll to their irresponsibility. Each and every person affiliated with selecting this narrative for airtime should be held accountable."
Held accountable.
The idea that there are stories of real people who have experienced real pain and real harm, and their stories should not be told, is a remarkable claim.
Yes, and the
Remarkable
not
claim.
in the slightest veiled threat, holding accountable people for telling stories, like, for example, Jesse Singal, who has
Indeed
been falsely portrayed and, what would the term be, demonized online, who has been quite good about reporting on all sides of the trans issue. So I did want to add one other thing here, which, in the spirit of what we were talking about last week regarding Kendi and the idea that there are certain things that fit on a card that actually tell the story, right? It strikes me that at the heart of the issue of transition and detransition is the hypocrisy of a movement. And mind you, I'm not talking about trans people. You and I draw a distinction. Trans activists are the ones who have become so troubling and frightening. But if trans rights are human rights, right? If the right to transition is a human right, then surely people who have already transitioned also have the right to transition and have the right to have that story told, right? So my point is, if the only people on Earth who don't have the right to transition are people who've already done it, something is off, right? And if those who are advocating for trans people are the ones who are ruling out the discussion, then they are telling you what they're up to, right? This is a one-way phenomenon from their perspective.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And we need to recognize that, and we need to frankly stare down the threats, because there's the group of people who have decided that transition is what they need to do, and there is an infinitely large group of people who have yet to make such a decision, and many of them are children. They are easily influenced, and they have a right to have normal development unfold before irreversible decisions are made on their behalf.
Exactly. And it's not that everything in this landscape is clear cut, right? For those extremely rare people who really would describe themselves to you, and some of them have described themselves to us as having been born in the wrong body, the earlier they would be allowed to transition, the more likely their understood and deeply felt brain sex could become in accord with the body that they are then allowed to transition into. That is a tiny fraction of 1% of humanity, a tiny fraction, probably 100th of 1%. For the vast majority of people, regardless of how they view themselves, how comfortable they are in their skin, whether or not they're gay, straight, bi, whatever, the vast majority of people who do not end up feeling that the way that they must live in the world forever after is as the sex that they were not born to, messing with development is permanent and tragic and going to result in things like infertility, mental health problems, and other physical problems like bone density loss.
Yeah, and
This is
sexual dysfunction, which is
and sexual dysfunction. Yes, all and that's an incomplete list.
yeah.
So it is not the right of a tiny number of people to change development for everyone else. And in fact, it's and having children have this thrust on them because they say something in the spirit of childhood where they're exploring identity because that's what childhood is should be criminal. It should be criminal.
It should be. I would also point out that somehow we have been lured into a conversation in which everything downstream of the concept of trans is taken to be sacred. And this doesn't make any sense. We have said repeatedly that too many cultures have trans as some role, ancient cultures, for us to imagine that this is some new invention or that it is inherently a disorder. However, this is not the same thing as saying pharmaceutical transition and surgical transition is ancient. It isn't. And so to the extent that we are talking about who has surgery available to them, how early in life, when can we disrupt a developmental process in order to ostensibly help you, these are not simple matters, right? And they are very different from the right to live as you would, right?
Yes.
Right. The ability to be surgically altered as you would is not a human right, right? We have not declared it such, right? There are surgeries you can't go get, right? So this is not one of those things. And we need to stop pretending it is. Compassion for people is important, and the recognition that trans is something real and ancient is important. That is very different from pharmaceutical and surgical alteration.